Welcome to The Path is Always Evolving, a podcast for healing humans and curious souls. Hosted by energy healer Tina Eichenberg and mind body specialist Eva Zobian Wolf, this show blends science and spirit to explore real life healing, self care, and personal transformation. No fluff, no fixing, just grounded conversations that meet you where you are. Because healing isn't linear, but the path, it's always evolving. Hello and welcome to The Path is Always Evolving. I am your co-host, Eva Zobian Wolf. I am a nurse and yoga therapist. I specialize in the physiological benefits of yoga therapy for preventing, treating burnout due to stress management or lack of stress management skills, specifically self-care. And my co-host is the beautiful and energetic
Tina Eichenberg. Thank you so much. I am an energy healer and a self-care coach, and I help individuals through overwhelm, burnout, anxiety, depression on an energetic level. And then we add in some self-care tips for long lasting life tools, hacks, those kinds of things.
so
And
in this sorry,
yeah,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
In this podcast, we are going to be exploring all of the different aspects of how we as human beings using energy work and self-care are constantly evolving. We are constantly growing and changing and focusing on becoming the better, happier, healthier versions of ourselves. And so we are your guides in how we're implementing it in our own life for ourselves and our clients and sharing that information with you.
Absolutely. So excited to get started on today's episode. We're talking
So
about boundaries. Yeah.
this
So
is, sorry, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say, so if you're constantly replaying conversations in your head, wishing you had said something differently, rationalizing somebody else's behavior in order to avoid conflict. This is a big one. Gaslighting yourself. Gaslighting is a big buzzword right now that's going around. At least it's showing up on my social media, about what gaslighting is and what it's not, and all those kinds of things. But gaslighting yourself, saying things like, maybe I'm just being too sensitive. What is it that I said that ticked them off? What was it that I?
Well, and the opposite too is allowing people to, one of the ways that I am working on myself is not over talking, which I have done. If you've noticed, I've done it several times with Tina today. And one of my challenges is trying to find the appropriate pauses to ask her questions or to respond to something that she's saying. But again, we're in this dynamic of we're talking about this together. In a conversation where we're speaking to another person, one of our boundaries is not speaking over the other person, listening for the purpose of understanding, not listening to respond.
I've done it a couple times too.
But the other thing too is, gaslighting is something that we're doing to ourselves, but it's also something that people do to us. And one of the ways that we can navigate that is by establishing healthy boundaries.
Absolutely.
So, how
Absolutely.
has this shown up in your life as you've been evolving as you in terms of growth markers?
Hmm. Yeah. So when I first had to start setting boundaries, well, I always thought I had good boundaries. You know, being a teenager, 20 something year old, I thought I had good boundaries. It wasn't until, and I thought that way for many years. It wasn't until 2019 that I really, yeah, so not very long ago, that I really started to understand that I was letting certain people cross my boundaries. And Most of the time it was my parents. And people are going to probably be listening to the first few episodes of this and be like, oh my gosh, she's got parent problems. But that's where it all kind of stems from, is my childhood and growing up and having to navigate relationships with my parents. And so that's where a lot of my healing had to be done from. And so one of the boundaries, the first boundaries that I had to set, was with my mom. And it was that I wasn't going to respond to any of her emails that were making me feel manipulated, bullied, or put down. And if anything in her emails made me feel that way, I was not going to respond to the email.
And as Gen X, we talked about this a little bit before too, as Gen X, that was not a societal parameter.
Mm-mm.
There was no boundaries.
No.
Everything was fair game. We talked about certain topics, but it was also certain expectations.
Mm-hmm.
And I can say whatever I want, and if you don't like it, that's a you problem, not a me problem. That's
Right.
not how
And
we've
and
phrased it, but yeah.
yeah, and to that, the last episode we were talking about people pleasing, how people respond to us is not our problem. It it goes both ways, right? We need to set boundaries so that people don't, whether it's a physical boundary, emotional, mental, so that even energetic boundaries we have to set. But we need to set these so that we maintain our health, whether it's mental health, physical health, emotional health, energetic health. We have to set those boundaries. And how I responded to my mom when she would send emails with big red capital letters, right? How I respond was not her problem. It was my problem to set up those boundaries to prevent her from continuing to do that. So that was the first time I really took responsibility for how I was feeling.
Okay, so that's a key point right there. So say that last part again.
I took responsibility for how I was feeling.
So you had control over how you responded. You had no control over how your mother behaved, reacted, responded, how she interacted with you.
Mm-hmm. No, no. And in fact, after I sent that email, I got an email from my dad saying that my mother would like me to not contact her for a while.
Mm. Okay,
Yeah.
so when somebody responds in that manner, when we establish a boundary, that speaks to their level of ability to manage their own feelings. When
Mm-hmm.
they won't respect a boundary that you set,
Right.
that has to do with their own healing or lack of healing.
Yeah. Yeah. And to this day, I don't get emails from my mom. That might be one of the reasons why she does not reach out like she used to, because she doesn't know how to talk to me without. And I am so grateful that she is adhering to my boundary. But that's kind of the risk that you run into when you set a boundary, is there's a good chance that there one of two things is going to happen. They're either going to apologize for crossing your boundary, and they're going to work to not cross your boundaries anymore, or they're going to stop talking to you. Plain and simple.
Well, can I extrapolate on that for a second?
Hmm.
So when we establish a boundary, that person is going to either accept the boundary or they're going to not accept the boundary, and
Right.
their response, their reaction
Right.
can be a lot of different things. But
Yep.
they have two choices: accept,
Yeah.
honor,
Right.
not accept.
Yeah.
What they do from there is completely up to them.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And my mom chose to accept the boundary and not send emails anymore, and slow communication. And that was another hard pill to swallow, because that wasn't something that I anticipated. And you
And
can't
that's
anticipate
hard.
how someone else is going to respond to your boundary, because it's not all butterflies.
No, no. And it's setting boundaries is difficult because what happens is we see the person, and this is where extending kindness and compassion and non-judgment is incredibly not fun. It's not always rainbows and ponies and unicorns in in yoga land, um, because when we set those boundaries, how a person responds reflects their level of consciousness,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and it has nothing to do with us.
No.
But
No.
we also may have to go through a grieving process of recognizing that they're not in the space on a conscious level to honor our boundary
Right.
or to see it as a pivot point for themselves, a place for growth for themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about what it looks like for your boundaries to be accepted.
Mm.
So, a couple of things that I think I would have liked to have heard was, thank you for telling me. I'm sorry that my emails, trying to word this in the way that I would have liked to have heard it, or just a blanket statement, because it's not, because I don't want to say, I'm sorry that my emails made you feel that way,
Mm.
because how I responded to my mom's emails was, again, it was up to me.
Mm-hmm.
I could have ignored the red in the big letters, but I couldn't, because of where I was at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I would have liked to have heard, um just, I will try to do better.
I'm sorry.
Well, I don't know if sorry, I don't know if sorry was in her capabilities.
But that's one of the things that we when we set that
Yes.
boundary and somebody
Yeah.
crosses, when
Right.
somebody create when what we feel by somebody's reactions, we feel hurt by somebody's reactions. When somebody says I'm sorry, they recognize that their behavior
Was
caused us
hurtful.
pain.
Yeah.
It's an acknowledgement.
Yeah.
And when we set a boundary and say, this was hurtful,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't deserve that, and they don't say sorry,
Yeah.
then it also lets us know, it lets us know where they are.
Right.
And then there's a grieving process and seeing that and recognizing that that's who we have. Again, remember, the version of a person that exists in our mind only exists in our mind. And when the version that we have in our mind of a person is not met with the person that actually exists at this moment, there's a grieving process involved with that.
There is. There is.
And so, one of the things that, and, you know, I did not have a lot of boundaries as a kid. I was a hardcore people pleaser. I was a parent from a very early, I was placed into parent roles very early on as a kid. I was the translator for my parents. I was a lot of different roles, and a lot of my happiness depends on you doing exactly what I tell you to do. Like, you're doing this so that I will be happy type
Right.
situations.
Right.
So
Walking on eggshells.
setting boundaries for me was incredibly challenging, and that did not happen. It did not happen overnight. It didn't really start happening until well into my 30s.
Mhm.
It started, but then it really started happening when I did my yoga teacher training and really started some of the healing.
Yeah.
And that's where I learned about the work of Brene Brown and started reading a lot of her books. And, she has the saying that the people that live most wholeheartedly have the most boundaries.
Hmm.
Where they're protecting their space, they're protecting their self-care, they're saying what they mean, and setting that boundary of, this is what I'm saying. I'm
Right.
saying this with love. I'm saying this with kindness. I'm saying this with compassion. This is a firm, this is this is what I'm capable of right now, and that's it. This is my expectation, and
Yeah.
this is it. So there's a lot of communication that's involved in that. In yoga, we talk about it as creating a container. I'm
Right.
creating a space. I'm creating a container. And if I'm working with my clients, that space is there for them to do their work, how they do their work, whether they choose to do the work. And I'm just creating the container. I'm offering the tools, the resources, but I'm not involved in the work. In my own practice, I am creating my own container, and I'm creating my own work. I'm doing my work. I'm doing my self-care practices, and I'm doing my journaling and my meditation and my mindfulness, and looking at, where am I the problem,
Yeah.
right? And setting those boundaries and saying, okay, here's what I have a tendency to do. I'm working on this. So I am going to be not doing this. I am going to
Right.
be doing this.
Yeah.
And being very clear. We
Yeah.
talked about this in people pleasing. When we say no, no is a complete sentence. So when somebody says, "Can you work an extra shift?" No.
Yeah.
End of story.
And if they
Can
say
you?
why, you don't have to tell them.
That's a boundary. When you talk to me and you belittle me and you gaslight me, and the thing is, we can have these conversations with ourselves
Right.
and not have the conversation with the person, but our
Yeah.
behavior dictates how we respond to them. So if
Yep.
if I'm having a conversation with someone and they keep, oh my gosh, this happened to me the other day. I went to go buy a pair of running shoes, and I walk into the store, and the person says, "Let me grab you some socks so you can try on the shoes." And I said, "That's okay. I brought my own socks." And she looked at me and said, "Oh, but you'll like our socks. Here, let me grab you a pair."
Yeah.
I'm sorry, did I not just say I have socks? So you're basically telling me that my socks aren't good enough and I don't
Right.
know enough about my own socks to use my socks? And so in that moment, I had a decision. Well, do I just get up and walk out of the store, or do I continue with the transaction? Well, she
Right.
wasn't the person that I was working with, somebody else was. And I set a boundary, you
Yeah.
know, keep talking to me like that and I'm going to walk out. And that, again, you choose, you
Yeah.
make the decision. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm
Yep.
telling you the consequence.
Yeah. You have to give them a consequence because then it's not a boundary. It's just a statement.
And there is a way to do it without, if every time somebody belittles you, get up and you walk into the other room.
Yep.
And then, you walk back and you're having a conversation and you're talking and then they belittle you again. Oh, I'm going off to the bathroom. So
Yep.
you can choose. You can create a boundary, and if they
Yep.
know it or not. So again, it depends on whether you want to what's your relationship with that person, whether you want to have that conversation. But there are
Mm-hmm.
ways to have that boundary setting.
Right.
And if they're like, man, every time I start talking, you walk out, and you say, well, when you belittle me, I'm going to walk away.
Yeah.
And they're like, I didn't
Now, do
realize
you,
I was doing that.
some people would say, shouldn't you have that conversation before you stand up and walk away?
The question is, if you know that person or you don't know that person, what's your relationship with them? And what is their ability? What is their level of consciousness? What is their ability to take accountability and responsibility for their own behavior? If they are consistently showing that they are not wanting to evolve, they're not
Right.
wanting to grow as a person,
Right.
you don't owe them. You have no obligation to tell them you're setting a boundary. They're either going to recognize it or not.
There is no obligation. Again, we go back to that word in the previous podcast, in the previous episode. We don't have an obligation to have to explain ourselves. If it is somebody that you care about, that you have a relationship with, and you want to, um, you know that they're trying to evolve, then have a conversation with them. Let them know that when you do this, hi Oliver, that when you do this, this is what's going to occur.
And there's also a time and place for those conversations
Right.
as well, too.
Yeah.
Making sure that you're rested, nourished, caffeinated,
Yep.
that both in the mental space to have an honest, productive conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes, unfortunately, sometimes you're going to set boundaries. You're going to propose boundaries when none of that is in play because you're doing it based off of your emotions at the time. And don't poo-poo on yourself if that happens because in that moment you needed to set those boundaries. Well, hello.
And that was part of my journey and growth, was learning when to have those conversations. My husband used to say to me a lot, you are too truthfully truthful. Because I would just say things
Yeah.
and not take into consideration that I was tired. I hadn't eaten. He was tired. He hadn't eaten. That, wrong time, wrong place. Pick your moments
Yeah.
and enter into that conversation in the way that feels right for you.
Yeah.
Again, kindness, compassion, non-judgment.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about, you set a boundary and for a while somebody seems to be adhering to it. And it's been a couple years. It's been a while that you've had to reinstill a boundary. What does that look like for the listeners to do? How do you reinstill a boundary after a period of time of the boundary being set and someone's crossing it? Let's take for instance new grandparent,
Mm.
new grandparent. Okay. And I'll use a story from when my kids were little. I had asked my mom, my parents, and I always go back to my mom because I never had any problems with my in-laws. my in-laws were my in-laws were always very supportive and um open to whatever it was that we needed.
Respectful of
And
boundaries.
they were respectful about our boundaries. They never crossed our boundaries ever, that I can remember. Once did they cross our boundaries. Um my mom used to watch my kids on occasion, and she would take them for a week during the summer because we lived in an hour and a half away from them. And whenever she would have them overnight or whatever, they would always come home with a list of things that they did poorly. That would always have a list of stuff that they did that I needed. My mom needed to talk to me about, that the kids were doing. And at one point, I told my mom that I didn't want to hear every single bad thing that they did. That unless they were really hurting themselves or hurting somebody else, right? There was a discussion of, like, I can't remember the exact discussion, but there was a discussion of, like, if this type of stuff happens, tell me, right? If she hits her brother and you've asked her not to do it and she does it again, tell me, right? If she's taking a spoonful of sugar out of the sugar bowl and you told her not to and she did it again, questionable. Questionable for me. Because my mom would spin it as, my daughter has a sugar addiction. And this was why I set the boundary, was because it was things as for me and my kids, it was, she was taking sugar out of the sugar bowl and it turned into a sugar addiction. I don't even know where I was going with this conversation.
Setting boundaries.
So I set the boundary that I didn't want to hear.
I know my non-poker face is probably distracting you. My eyes are
I did
bulging out
I
of their
didn't
head.
I didn't want to hear every single little thing that my kids were doing bad. And that worked for a little while. I would get a few things that happen, right? Like, I don't know, they left the yard without asking. That kind of thing, which was fine. That I needed to know. But then after about 6 months, I started getting the long list of stuff again. And the boundary I set after that was, they're too busy to come over anymore. Because I couldn't, my kids were getting in trouble for so many things being over there, that for me were minor. And so if they were major for my mom, then I needed to prevent them from doing those things at her house.
And there's the other thing too is if she's sending these emails to you, what is she saying to the kids when that's happening?
Right, when I'm not around. I have thought about that.
Because yeah, I have found that, there's a number of things that are being said about me to my children from grandparents
Mm-hmm.
that I'm like, really?
Yeah.
That's
So sometimes boundaries get pushed, and they get pushed to the point where you need to pull back contact.
so one of the things for us to be mindful of is that when we're setting boundaries, so again, it comes back to people have a choice. They can either accept the boundary or they cannot accept the boundary and they keep doing the behavior for which we are setting the boundary.
Yeah.
And one thing for us to recognize, and I used this analogy this weekend, and after I said it, everybody's like, "Oh my gosh, what a great analogy!" And I thought, I got to remember this because this actually was fantastic. Um, it all comes back to physiology, right? It comes back to the physiology in our body, and we're behaving through our nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a person with poor boundaries that is constantly not listening to another person's boundaries, and we're all going through this to a certain extent, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
When we are in an activated nervous system, meaning that we are far more in sympathetic nervous system than we are balanced, there are certain things that happen in our brain where our ability to put connections together goes offline.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you imagine trying to look at the instructions on how to put together an IKEA cabinet, anything, IKEA furniture, right?
Yep.
And if you think when you're anxious, you're nervous, you're excited, anything where you're in a sympathetic nervous system activation moment and you're trying to read through that instruction manual and you're trying to put that furniture together, it is far more challenging than if you are calm and relaxed, rested, fed, caffeinated. And then you look at that same instruction manual and all of a sudden everything makes sense. And you're like, oh, I take this piece and I grab this thing and I put this here and you're putting it together and it flows because you're able
Right.
to make those connections. When we set boundaries with people and someone does not recognize the boundary or they set the boundary, again, this comes back to neuroplasticity, the patterns that are written into their brain. You set the boundary and they went, okay, that was only one instance.
Mm-hmm.
The pattern in their brain is to ignore your boundary. The pattern that is ingrained in their brain, the pattern that is set in their brain is to ignore your boundary and behave however they want to behave.
Right.
When we set a boundary, we have to help them to create a new pattern in their brain. And that takes time. And that old pattern is highly accessible, it's well paved, it's super easy, and then the communication is super fast.
Mm-hmm.
Our brain loves patterns and it will always revert back to the pattern that has the least resistance. And they're always behaving through their nervous system, through the state of their nervous system. And when their nervous system is activated, their brain goes to the pattern that is the easiest and the quickest. And it doesn't matter how long they've been in this new pattern of recognizing the boundary. When they get massively stimulated or they get triggered for some reason, the newer patterns aren't the quickest, and their
Yeah.
brain shifts back to that old pattern.
Oh yeah.
And so
That happens with everything, right?
that happens with everything. And
Yeah.
that's a really simplistic way of looking at it.
Yeah.
But when you understand it and you go, man, why can't this person just recognize that I said no?
Right. Right.
When it comes down to the physiology, what are they capable of?
Right. Right. And so you have that choice to either keep reinstilling your boundaries or saying, I'm sorry, I can't continue having to put this boundary up. I'm done.
And if we keep coming back to, okay, I have to keep reasserting the boundary.
Mm-hmm.
Their messaging system, their ability to receive the boundary is obstructed.
Right.
Then it's not because they don't love you, it's not because they don't care about you. It is literally only about them
Yeah. Yeah.
and
And
the
it doesn't
state of their
matter.
nervous system.
Right. And it doesn't matter how you place the boundary. You can place it because a lot of people are going to be, if they're emotionally intelligent, they're going to place these boundaries with compassion and with empathy.
Mm-hmm.
However, if they're not, they're going to set these boundaries with rigidity and walls. And so even when you're setting boundaries, you still have to be careful of how you set them, because that can produce a whole nother load of problems.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
sometimes if you know your customer, if you know who you're talking to, you may have to set that rigid boundary to begin with. So it's you do what is healthiest for you, and it is not your problem how they respond to your boundary.
And that's a big distinction because we have that hope, right? That I'm going to say this and I'm going to ask that you honor this boundary. I'm going to say this and I ask that you understand and behave or respond accordingly.
Yeah.
And that person's either going to choose to honor the boundary or they're not. And if they choose to honor it, but also they said, well, fine, I'm going to do that, but I just want you to know that you're a horrible human being for making me do this. That is completely up to them.
Yep.
That is completely their reaction. And again, that is their nervous system talking.
Yeah.
That is their shadows talking. That's the state of their ability to be kind and compassionate.
Right. Yeah.
One of the practices in yoga is to practice non-possessiveness. And what this means is non-attachment, not holding.
Mm-hmm.
It's the let it go. So saying I'm going to create this boundary and I am going to let go of how you respond to it. That
Yeah.
either you honor it or you don't honor it, but whatever you
Yeah.
do is your decision.
Yep. Yeah. Have you read that book, Let Them?
It is on my list of books to get. I need to stop by my local bookshop. I stopped at a Barnes and Nobles and looked for it and didn't find it, but I also didn't ask. I was just wandering through real quick,
Yeah.
but
That
I've
is
been
that is
hearing a
another
lot about
thing
it.
that is going around is people are saying just let them. Just let
Hmm.
them be. Just let them be them.
Hmm.
But I think there is a line there
Say
that
more.
let them be them, but don't let them behave in a way that is demeaning to you.
Correct. And again, that's establishing a boundary.
And
Let
so,
them be.
right, right. So I haven't read the book yet, but I have heard two different sides of how the book is taken. And so maybe that's something that you and I can do is both get the book and read it, and then we can discuss it on a future episode.
I think that's a great idea.
But I did pull up some quotes on boundaries, and Brene Brown was one of the ones that popped up.
I
And
love
it is
Brene
daring
Brown.
to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves, even when we risk disappointing others.
And that's a big thing. Okay, so let's talk about that for a quick second. When somebody expects you to behave a certain way, do you have an obligation to meet that expectation?
Right. Yeah.
And
It
the
all
answer is
ties
no.
in. No. Simple sentence. No.
No. I mean, every single woman somewhere has had somebody say, I expect you to do this
Mm-hmm.
without asking,
Yep.
is this something that you would like to do?
Yeah.
the whole idea, well, you should be thinner. You should be you should put weight on. You should
Right.
smile. You shouldn't be so smiley. You
Yeah.
shouldn't be so loud. You shouldn't be so quiet. Right? These are all expectations, and our boundaries are in saying, screw you.
Yep.
So one of the things that, and we're going to talk about this in another episode when we talk about the energy of language.
Mm-hmm.
And when we say things like, well, this is just who I am, there's so much in there because the question there is that your authentic self or is that your protected self?
Right. Is that your ego that's jumping out? Yeah.
Because that's a deflection of this is my behavior
Yep.
and you either
Yep.
like it or you don't like it. So
Exactly.
again, kindness, compassion, non-judgment. It goes both ways.
Yeah. Yeah. So make sure you guys come back for next session, our next episode next week, and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Eva, do you have anything else you want to leave with the listeners?
Keep being your absolute amazing self. You are the only one in the world. Be that amazing self. Stand into your awesomeness.
Brilliant. Brilliant. All right. We'll see you guys later. Have a
Take
great day.
care.